Art style is, and perhaps has always been, an all-consuming black hole of conversation and thought in artistic circles. It would be difficult to track how many videos float around on YouTube promising to help you develop your style in 30 days, or how to find your style with these 5 steps. As a student, I heard teacher after teacher dissuade students from stylizing their artwork, asking them to focus on the basics and the fundamentals. And as a teacher, I likely did the same thing at one point or another. There is a strong desire among artists to find a style or to hone the one you already possess. But is this good? Not categorically, but is this good for you, the individual, the artist? Why do we focus on style? What happens when we do, and how do we respond to that? This is what we're going to be looking into in this episode of the podcast. So what is art style? We are not going to spend a lot of time here. We all have some background concept of what it is, even if the vapor trails are faint. Art style seems to be the particular arrangement of techniques, strategies, tools, concepts, and inclusions that lead to an identifiable and consistent appearance, often able to be attributed to a particular artist or theme. Goodness, what a mouthful. In simpler terms, art style is the distinct appearance of a particular artist's work, whether by choice or by chance. As pervasive as it is, I think it might be beneficial to take a few minutes and talk about some of the reasons artists tend to focus on style, and specifically on finding their own or mimicking someone of importance or influence. This is something that we as artists tend to do, and I think most of us have done this at some point or another. It can come from a need for personal identity, the desire to stick out, to be original, or the ability to be recognized. Truthfully, this is what we see when we think of our favorite artists' unique styles. It's what identifies their artwork as being theirs. And these distinct signifiers are what are being used now by AI art to construct things, fabricate things out of what seems like thin air that approximates an artist's particular and specific style. There is something unique to each artist, each person who has strived to hone their skills to a level where they can represent things the way that they desire to. We see this beauty in every art form that we look at. I followed this for ages in Blizzard's old artwork, starting with Warcraft 1 all the way through World of Warcraft. I loved those artists, and their styles are unique and distinct. Sometimes we can focus on style for the sake of consistency. Style guides exist for a reason. They help us to be consistent with our work. If you memorize a set of guidelines or how to create eyes, faces, anime figures, it's easy to rely on those things when you don't know what to do. Style can help with consistency because it simplifies ridiculously complicated things. Art is difficult, and it's difficult to make sure that your art is consistent from one day to another. And so if you memorize stylistic choices that you have made or that another artist has made, it becomes much easier to do the same thing day after day, frame after frame, especially if you're working with things like animation. Comfort zone is another reason. The journey of art is a long one. And having something reliable to return to, something you can trust, can help give you sanctuary on that long and arduous trek. Like a little hermit crab, we have our retreat, our safe haven to fall back into when things get risky. The danger, of course, is sometimes you can outgrow the shell and hold on to it when you ought to exchange it for something new. But a comfort zone is hard to dispute, especially with the difficulties that come with art and the journey accompanying it. It makes sense to return to things that are easier, simpler, or even just known. A style can be an appeal to the market. If you are looking to start or continue an art career, having a style can be important. As mentioned above, it can make your work more consistent. It can also make it recognizable. It's easier to sell your skills when someone recognizes you for what you do, or even if they can tie you in with another set of artists. Adhering to a style that is selling well can be a justification. Anime isn't selling in your niche? Change the style. Portrait paintings are doing particularly well in your little town in Montana? Change up the style. What about forced evolution? And this is perhaps a strange one, but sometimes we can feel like we are locked into something, like we need to change, and creating or adhering to a style can help us feel like we are growing. We can try to force our own artistic growth, our evolution, by establishing or grafting ourselves to a style. Sometimes we desire to grow, to evolve so much that we can link ourselves to something that we see as more advanced than us and use that to pull us along. If you're curious on some of the reasons why artists have this just inbuilt desire to grow, I have another podcast you can check out in the description down below. Sometimes we can seek style because we think that it is necessary. And sometimes it really is this simple, thinking that real artists have a style. And maybe we are right. Maybe you, artist, are right. Maybe most artists do have a style. But it is not a requirement for you to be a real artist, whatever the heck that means. There is sometimes pressure from teachers, friends, parents, or just the greater artistic community to define yourself and to adhere to a school, a style. It makes me think about Harry Potter or the Owl House, where young children just starting to get a handle on their magic are placed into a house or convent, in some ways overtly guiding their progress. If Hogwarts was an artistic school, how would a Slytherin or a Gryffindor paint? What would differentiate one from the other? Would the Ravenclaw's knowledge come in at some point and be crucial? Or would the loyalty of the Hufflepuffs, or maybe they would just make food for everyone and use that as a method? I don't know, but let me know in the comments down below. What would the Harry Potter houses look like if they were artistic houses instead? The last reason that I want to hit on for why this happens is affection for our idols. This is so terribly understandable. And honestly, who hasn't done this? We copy the art of the people we admire. We draw things we love. Sometimes our desire to have a style is an effort to appeal to that idol, and sometimes it is a vicarious desire to be more like them. This often happens without artists even being aware of it. Musicians often start to sound like their inspirations. It's only natural. So much of my formative art was simply copying things from Nintendo instruction manuals, where the art for Mega Man or Donkey Kong or Super Metroid was contained. We didn't have art books back then, or if we did, my 10-year-old self didn't have access to those things. So sometimes it's just the affection for the things we love that pulls us and draws us toward a particular style. Before moving into the dangers of focusing on art style, I want to take just a moment to clarify who this applies to. If you feel trapped because you don't have an art style yet, if you feel like you have to stick to the style that you have laid out, or if you feel like your art is inferior to another form of art due to the style on either side, then this section is for you. I think in general it is good for us as artists to challenge convention, and we do it with almost everything we do. The flip side of this is that we ought to be willing to challenge our own conventions as well. So often I return to Aristotle's mean that the good life lies between the two extremes. So let's take a look at some of the dangers of over-focusing on art style and see where this leads us. The first is stagnation. It ought to come as no surprise that focusing on a singular style might cause stagnation in certain areas. This is what many art teachers are attempting to address when they tell students not to draw anime. What they really mean is you should get a good grasp on the fundamentals before you stretch them. Otherwise, you won't understand what you're doing. And in this, they are largely correct. Many of our favorite artists that create manga or anime have focused significant portions of their youth on the study of reality, of real life. Many have backgrounds in anatomy, in figural studies, and in traditional drawing. These skills give them the ability to do the complicated things that they do on a weekly or monthly basis for serialization. Art is complicated, and starting with the fundamentals allows you then to abstract things, which is exactly what manga and anime stylings are. They're an abstraction of our reality. So focusing on one thing alone can prevent growth. It can lead to this stagnation. Repeating things another artist does without knowing why is another one of the potential issues. Copying other artists' work is often one of the quickest ways to learn. When you copy style, you do the same thing, picking up little tips, tricks, stylistic simplifications that make life easier. The problem with this is that you won't always know why the artist chose to make the decision that they made. Sometimes this will not affect the outcomes, and sometimes this will dramatically affect your future work. If you copy figures and faces that are highly stylized, trying to learn how to turn them in 3D space can be very difficult. Copying an exact color without thinking about why the artist chose that color can be harmful and make your art feel too pastel or cartoony. Of course, sometimes this can be good. I've had this problem many times, especially with traditional painting. I can look at my reference piece, whether it's a painting or even if it's reality, and instead of thinking about the why of that color or that shape being indicated there, I just copy the thing, and my result never quite looks as good. I've learned from a lot of much better painters over the years that when you look at the thing, you have to make a decision about why you're doing what you're doing. You're obviously not representing the exactitude, which is probably not a word, the exactness of the thing that you are replicating, that you are painting. You're creating an icon of it, an avatar of it on your canvas, as it were. And so you have to think about each mark you're making, each color that you're choosing, and primarily each shape that you're putting down, what that communicates and what that says. It's why you're able to simplify things. It's why Impressionistic art is so beautiful despite not really representing reality. It almost represents something like a super reality. It's like when you get a dessert that is an apple pie and it tastes more apple-y than an actual apple. It's mystifying. It's this bizarre thing. Art allows us to do that. It allows us to make a thing that is more than the thing that it's based on, which is this wonderful, beautiful, crazy thing. You can limit your portfolio or marketability. If you desire to go somewhere with your art career, focusing on a singular style can limit your portfolio's representation of your skill set, or your very marketability. This is a more complicated and nuanced issue than I would like to talk about here, and better artists have done great videos about this. If you're more interested on this topic, I would recommend checking out Trent Kaniga or Marc Brunet. Both have awesome videos on this topic specifically. I've taken classes from both. They're great artists. They seem to be decent people, and I've been following them both for decades. So I will link some of their videos in the description below. But I would highly recommend, if you like anything that you're hearing from me, you will likely like the two of them as well. Another danger is creative repetition. As artists, we usually thrive on experimentation and newness. When we focus too heavily on copying a style or sticking to what we have claimed as our own, we inadvertently limit our ability to reach out and to do different things. If you decide to narrow in on a style and stick to it, I would encourage you to have a separate sketchbook or workspace just for things that are not of that style. I've run into this with a lot of artists. I actually have a friend who is a full-time oil painter up in the mountains here in Colorado. He does wonderful, beautiful paintings. His name is Carl Bork. And he actually has a channel here on YouTube and an Instagram thing. I'll link you there as well. I met him a very long time ago, and though I don't get much time to talk to him or interface with him on a yearly basis, he's always been a nice resource and a very kind man. He paints these beautiful, impressionistic landscapes primarily, but every so often he seems to get tired of doing the same thing, and he'll come out with these series of monochrome paintings. When he goes from his crazy yellows and vibrant purples and blues and greens, and then he'll do a series of paintings that are all in just black and white and maybe one other color. And they look really dark and almost macabre compared to all of his other works, but there's something beautiful in that, and he needs that difference. As artists, we can't do the same thing all the time. We have to try different things. We have to experiment, and we'll often grind ourselves to dust if we try to do the same thing day in and day out. So the fact that he, who is able to do this professionally and really seems to love what he does, even he has to take time every so often and do something very different from all of his other work. It's a good thing for us to keep in our mind that the creative repetition can sometimes be a dangerous side effect of over-focusing on style. Narrow skill development is another thing that can happen here. When you focus on a single style, you are solving problems in one particular way. And this can narrow your skill development from being broad to being very pinpoint focused. This is not a bad thing for all artists. If you are interested in portrait painting, you are going to heavily focus on that. If you really enjoy anime and that's just the kind of artwork that you want to do for yourself, go ahead. If you're interested in concept art, you're going to focus on those specific things. I would recommend that you simply keep an awareness of this. That's the big thing with so many of these so-called issues. They creep up on you if you are unaware. And sometimes in our excitement, in our dedication to finding a style or to just trying new things, we can lose some of that awareness and we can narrow our focus. A loss of spontaneity is another thing that can happen here. Tunnel vision is easy to succumb to. Spontaneity exists more heartily when you have the freedom to do many things. And we love doing many things so much of the time. Focusing too heavily on a particular style can reduce your creative freedom, often in ways you are unaware of in your conscious mind. It's more of a, I'm going to draw a character, and you slip into the same way of drawing a woman that you always do, rather than asking what benefits this character best. This is another one that just continues with a lack of awareness. If you're not aware of this, it's very easy to do, and then you find yourself having spent 6 months drawing a thing in a particular way. And again, this is not always a problem. It's the lack of awareness and lack of attention to that thing that becomes a problem. Because if you're unaware, you fall into a habit, and then a long time later you go, oh crap, this is not what I intended, or I really want this other skill, or I'm moving away from this style now and I didn't notice that I'd cemented my feet into the ground and this is where I'm stuck. Burnout is the last of the reasons that I want to look at, the last of the dangerous things that can happen when you over-focus on style. Burnout is a terrible thing, a beast that raises its head yet again. It is a real possibility when it comes to focusing on a single thing. I'm not going to linger here, but burnout is scary and ought to give you pause if you start feeling it closing in upon you. And I strongly believe that burnout will almost always indicate itself before it arrives. This doesn't always look the same way, but if you think about yourself, if you think about how you're approaching your art, there are symptoms of burnout long before it collides with you. It's kind of like a meteor maybe coming in to like smash the earth and destroy everything that we love. You're going to see it coming. It's not going to just come out of nowhere. But pay attention, be aware. Now, that is not an exhaustive list of every potential danger from over-focusing on art style. In addition, I think it's important to remind myself and to all of you who are listening that art style by itself is not a bad thing. I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's really the over-dedication to it, the assuming that it is so fundamental to being an artist or so important that is dangerous. It shares this same trait with overthinking, where overdoing a thing is bad. And we run into this a lot. Aristotle talks about this, and I seem to bring him up pretty frequently because it's the good life that is found in between the two extremes, in between the absolute dedication to style and the absolute abandonment of style. There's obviously something good, something beautiful in the mean, in the median, in the middle ground between those two things. And that, I think, is what we have to hone in on. So many of our weird and fundamental issues as artists seem to come from the fact that we over-dedicate ourselves to a singular thing, to a singular focus. This is understandable because art is so vast, there are so many things to dedicate ourselves to that it can very easily become overwhelming if one tries to process all of them. So the very human reaction to that is to focus on a single one. It makes us feel less overwhelmed. It reduces stress and anxiety, and it just makes us feel more content in the moment. It's not necessarily going to help our art journey progress any faster, but it might actually help in that one particular area. So I just wanted to lay this out. It might be a little rambling, but I think it's important to just go ahead and mention again that art style is not a bad thing. It's the over-dedication to it. So here are some things that we can focus on instead of just focusing on style. The first of these is actually more psychological and mental. Big surprise for anybody who's been listening to the channel for any amount of time. Realize that your own art, whether it has a defined style or not, is still valid, important, and interesting. You don't need a style. You can choose to have one. You can fall into one, but it isn't needed. Sometimes thinking about this, really analyzing it, owning it, can help with your mindset. And understanding as well that your art is probably already stylized toward a particular end. And that if you don't focus on it, it's probably going to happen anyway. There's this weird duality where if you seek a style, and even if you find one then, but if your just end game goal is to find a style, it's probably going to be a lesser version of what it would have been if you had just progressed naturally. If you allow yourself to move naturally through the artistic world, if you allow yourself to find where your joy springs forth, and the things that you are good at, the things that you are really encouraged by or are intrigued by, find interesting, if you just allow yourself to explore that naturally, I think in most cases a style will emerge. I've seen this with most artists I've followed, I've seen this with many artists I've taught, and I've seen this in some capacities with myself over the years. Though I kind of fall into this "I haven't solidified my style yet" category. I'm just not particularly worried about it. It seems to me from that experience, from watching people through 11 years of teaching and through 20 years of observing professional artists, style just happens. It happens because the jobs that you've been commissioned to work on are consistent, and therefore style emerges. It happens because of the influences and inspirations that you have in your life. So just realize that your own art, whether it has a style yet or not, is still valid. It's still important. And you don't necessarily need to have a style. If that component, if that idea is giving you anxiety, try to let it go. It'll either happen naturally or it won't happen, but it's really not that important of a thing. Now, if you really want your art to go down a stylistic path, that's fine. That's fun, and have fun with it. Have fun and find joy in the process of uncovering that. Think of yourself like an archaeologist. You're trying to find this innate component of yourself. And if you choose to, and if you focus on it, you can find joy in that. It can be a really intriguing endeavor. Remember that art takes time. Let's say for a moment that your focus on style is justified, that it is not detrimentally affecting you in the ways that I've already talked about. And this is very potentially the case with you. You have dodged the bullet, so to say, and yet you still find yourself here, hopelessly searching for your style. You've put months into it, years perhaps, and you just can't quite figure it out. Art takes time. It always has, it always will. This is what keeps many people from doing it, and this is what makes artistic success so valuable. Try to give yourself some grace. Remember that the journey is long, and your goal today is simply to crawl 1 yard closer to your destination, not to achieve it. So if it feels like it's taking forever to find your style, that might actually be the case. It might actually be taking a ludicrously long amount of time for you to solidify and find your art style. This doesn't mean you're a bad artist. It's never meant that you are a bad artist. It might mean your style is different, that there's few analogs out there, and there isn't then a mentor figure that you can reach out and grasp really heartily and easily. It might mean that you are going to lay down a pathway that other people are going to look to in the future. Many, many, many artists have done this over the years, right? People who have been trailblazers. They've tried new things. They've worked in new media. That's always a possibility. It's not particularly likely, but artists are strange. We are weird alien creatures that kind of just arrive on this earth and inhabit it and get strange looks and odd questions from all of the people around us. So if it's taking you a long time, understand that that's okay, that feeling sad or frustrated about the fact that it's taking you a long time is okay. Those are rational feelings to feel and to hold on to, but don't let them control you. Don't let them make you feel like you're a bad artist, that you'll never find your style, that your style is going to be lame or stupid. None of those things are categorically true. It's just a matter of the fact that art is a long path. It always has been. It always will be. It's part of the brotherhood and sisterhood that we find working in that. There's a camaraderie to those that stick to it. It's a beautiful thing, but it's beautiful because it's difficult, because those that get through are our comrades in arms. When we go to an art show, when you see people online, I hope that when you see people on Instagram and you look at their work, that you don't sit there and go, "You jerk, you're better than me." No, they are your brother and sister in this. They are another human who has put in the time and the effort, and they know your pain. They are in the same boat as you. Maybe it's a bigger boat, maybe it's a different boat, but it's the same kind of idea. They are working down the same manner of path. We all have to deal with this. We all have to deal with this. So just give yourself some grace. Remember, this whole process takes time. It doesn't make you a bad artist. It doesn't make your work invalid. Allow for and embrace imperfection. Whatever you can do to harp on yourself less, to be kinder about your progress and work, will benefit you immensely. I find that searching out a stressless or low-stress art form as a break from the difficult stuff is one of the best methods. You've probably heard me talk about this before with some of my sketchbook sessions, especially the ink drawing, where I'll just start working on a thing and not really have much of a plan. I do that not necessarily because it's good for my art progress. it keeps me in the art. And I think in general, that's beneficial. I'm a person who wants to grow, who wants to progress, who wants to make this a permanent part of his life. And so for me, just staying in it daily is a really, really good thing. But part of the reason I do it is because it's low stress, it's rewarding, it's invigorating, it's encouraging. It's nice to be able to sit down and do a thing and feel like you did a decent job at it. So if you are working on lots of projects, lots of things that are searching for that style, give yourself a break every once in a while. Come back to something that's a little bit easier, that's a little bit more comfortable, or just have a sketchbook where you just play with colors. There is nothing wrong with working on coloring books. There is nothing wrong with working on abstract, surrealistic, or non-representational art. There is sometimes almost this gatekeeping about those kind of things, that you're not a real artist if you don't pursue representational art or whatever it might be. It's all nothing. It amounts to nothing. If you were to weigh all of those opinions, you would find that the scale is not even aware that there's anything sitting upon it. It matters not. So embrace the imperfections as a natural part of the process. Try out art forms that are lower stress, or things that you just set yourself up with low expectations for a particular piece. It's hard to do, and this statement is trite, but it's valuable nonetheless. On the same train of thought, embrace experimentation. This obviously echoes the prior point, but might be a better solution for some of you. If you find it hard to embrace the imperfections, or that just doesn't really make sense to you, perhaps turn the tables and focus on experimenting. You will often find that experimenting lends itself more toward relaxed adventure than stuffy practice. And this can be in those similar trains of thought of abstract or just playing around with colors. It can be really anything. Part of what's beneficial with experimentation is that it tends to have fewer expectations attached to it. This means that you're going to be able to do things that are more freeing, that are more adventuresome than they would be otherwise. If you always work digitally and you sit down to work on your 17th digital piece this year or this month or whatever, then there are certain expectations concerning whatever the last piece turned out as. There are certain ideas, concepts about how you structure that work time, how you structure that piece. But if you always work digitally and you just grab a Sharpie and you go sit down with a piece of cardboard, the expectations will deteriorate and fall apart because it's so outside of your normal. This is kind of a fun thing to do sometimes. It's experimental. If it doesn't turn out, like, who cares? You're working on a piece of cardboard. But if it turns out well, you feel good about it. So try to set yourself up with experimental ideas, things that if they turn out poorly, you don't care. But if they turn out well, then there's something fun, something you can show off to people, you can throw on your Instagram, or you can just hold up at night and go, this was cool. I'm glad I did this. I don't do a ton of experimentation these days, partially because I've explored so many things through the years of teaching that now I'm finding joy in solidifying particular skills, working on individual things. But there are periods where I do experiment and I know that I will do it again. So it's not like I'm grown past this, I am too mature for this experimenting. No, there are artists that this is literally what they do. Raffi and Klee, who run an art channel here on YouTube. I think it's Raffi Does Art or Raffi Makes Art. I will link it in the description below. Their channel's changed names a couple times, so it's hard to keep track of. But he thrives on doing experimental art. He does everything, oil paintings, drawings, sketches, wooden sculptures, all kinds of stuff. He's a professional artist. And he's also just a joy to listen to. So if you haven't checked them out, I would highly recommend. They're wonderful human beings. So I will link their channel in the description down below. Try setting creative challenges for yourself. Practice converting things into and out of your perspective style. So this is kind of a strange one and feels maybe antithetical to the idea of what can we do instead of focusing on style. Well, because style isn't a bad thing, this can kind of be a nice way to play with style, but also play with other things. And so if you have a particular style or you yearn for a particular style, one of the best things that you can do with that is actually play around with things that artist or that you haven't worked with in the past. So just for example, let's assume that you're copying a style similar to Loish is. She's a wonderful artist, primarily works digitally these days, has this soft, almost ethereal way of representing people and environments. So you're copying her work. We're working on some of the stuff that she does. Well, how about you take a photo of a tree and you look at her artwork and you try to figure out if she was turning this into her style, what would that look like? Now, you could probably go find some examples of trees that she's done, that she's converted, but it's going to be good practice for you and a good mind game for you to try to figure out what does she do, what are the things that she does, and then try to translate that. I've done this with children's book authors and illustrators recently, where I've pulled some of these books aside and gone, okay, if I wanted to do something like this, I want to understand how this artist is making these decisions. And so I'll look at how he draws a character or how he draws a background and try to figure out what's going on here. And then I will try to draw my own thing and convert it into that style. For me, it's this weird hybridization of how much detail do I put into a thing. I have a lot of pen and ink drawings and paintings and such that I've done over the last 20 years that are highly, highly detailed. But I also have a graphic design background and I like really symbolic things. I like things that are really reduced. And finding that middle ground is really difficult for me. It's why a lot of the Inktober drawings that I've been working on for the last month have been really fun, because they're kind of finally finding this middle ground of the right amount of detail, the right amount of stylization. It's been exciting. And the first couple drawings all feel very generic. And then they kind of solidify and look a little bit more like the style of the artists that I was working from. But by the end of Inktober, they're starting to look like my own things. And that's really exciting. That's kind of the finding of a style through the copying and converting. So this is kind of a fun creative challenge for you. So if you are trying to solidify your style, but you feel like maybe you're focusing on it too much, or you just don't want to succumb to some of those dangers, try converting things into and out of style. This has all been talking about converting them in. Converting out can be really intriguing. Go finding a really hyper stylized thing and then converting it back to reality. I don't know that this really has any productivity in that, like, it's not going to be something you're going to share on social media and people are going to be like, oh, that's cool. But it's going to be really, really good practice for your brain and practice for your artistic sensibilities. So kind of a fun, strange thing. Seek feedback. Find people better than you and try to get their feedback on your work. In fact, they don't have to be better than you. They can be just similar in skill level to you, but try to find people who are capable of giving you feedback on your work. Teachers are great for this. Peers are beneficial as well. I have people I send artwork to when I don't know how to solve an issue. I've got a really good friend who I grew up with. We actually learned art together. Probably once a week, even now, I send him a picture and just say, I don't know how to fix this hand. Can you show me? Or the architecture of this situation, this environment just doesn't feel right. Can you help me? And he actually does the same thing, which is lovely. He'll send me things and be like, I'm working on these colors, but for some reason this isn't working out the right way. And it's really good to have somebody that you can do this with. Now, you might feel a little nervous or a little bit anxious if you don't have somebody that you've done this with prior. But if you have artistic friends, artistic buddies, they are probably going to be happy to do this. You can always ask, of course. You can always say like, hey, would it be okay if I send you something? But if you don't demand that much, if you are just asking for a couple sentences or even just a single thought about it, it's really not asking that much of another person. If you're still in school, whether it's middle, high school, or college, or even past that, then this is going to be much, much, much easier because your art teacher's job is basically to do this. So take your work to them and run it by them. And if they happen to be an art teacher who really despises the style that you're going after, well, chances are they're not the only art teacher in the building. So try to find a different one who's better in that aspect. And if you need to, you can always throw things up in other places like Instagram, and you might not get great feedback there. Maybe that's a terrible idea. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. I have had very, very poor, not like bad feedback, like bad negative comments, but just like no feedback, nothing beneficial from Instagram. So maybe that's a bad idea. So at some point I might need to set up a Discord just to have the ability for y'all to throw things up there and just get feedback from each other. But there are other artists that do that. I know that there are a lot of other artists here on YouTube who have those Discord channels. So if that's something you'd be interested in, just let me know. I can look into setting one up at some point here in the future. Artistic growth or evolution plan. I often talk about scheduling and planning, but I think it can work for those of us who are more structured in our approach to art. Obviously, this is me. I structure almost everything about my day. In fact, the whiteboard next to me has every day of this week lined out with all the things that I have to accomplish. This would be terribly overwhelming and anxiety-inducing for certain artists, but for me, it reduces the anxiety because I don't have to have the things floating around in my head. They're written down somewhere. So set your goals, schedule your explorations of style, look back at your past work, and notice the progress. So sometimes having the growth plan, the evolution plan for where you want to go, can make this a reduction in stress and anxiety for you. And what this looks like is if you are pursuing style, if you are trying to solidify your art style, understanding that you're not going to do it quickly. Like we talked about earlier, art takes a lot of time. Maybe you can set benchmarks. Like by 3 months from now, I'd like to have these kinds of things solidified. By 6 months from now, I'd like to have these kind of things solidified. It's really easy maybe to start with the year, right? In a year, I want to have my art style. I want it to be totally defined. And then you can work back from there. And then you can kind of look like, after a month, have I made steps towards that? Do my figures look more consistent? Do they look more stylized? Are they stylized in the way that I want them to be? And you can start measuring those things. This isn't going to work for everyone, but this is certainly how I work. I like to look back on the stuff I've done just a couple months ago and be like, yes, growth. Yes, much good. And if that's you, then this might work beneficially for you as well. And if it's not, if scheduling makes you anxious, maybe give it just a little try, like little teeny tiny parts of it. Maybe check out one of the videos that I have put together on scheduling, on organizing, or on building projects of the long term. Might be beneficial for you, but this isn't for everybody. It's certainly how I work, but I know better than to assume all artists are the same. This has been an entirely non-exhaustive exploration of artistic style. This topic is immense, and if you have thoughts or questions, please share them below. I would love to hear from you. This is a struggle for many of us, and I simply hope that this exploration was beneficial to you in some way. As always, thanks for watching and listening. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.